There are two kinds of power in this world. The first is loud. It announces itself with flags and fanfare, with soaring rhetoric and clenched fists. This is the power we see, the power we recognize instantly. It demands attention. It thrives on spectacle. It wants to be witnessed and remembered. But there is another kind of power, a quieter kind. It moves through whispered conversations in smoke-filled rooms. It operates through proxies and deniable assets. It shapes the world not through speeches, but through silence. This power does not seek recognition. It seeks results. When you think of Dwight D. Eisenhower, what image comes to mind? Perhaps it is the beaming war hero, waving to adoring crowds after liberating Europe from the grip of fascism. Perhaps it is the kindly grandfather in the Oval Office, presiding over an era of sock hops and suburban dreams, of poodle skirts and brand new Chevrolets. Perhaps it is simply the bold, smiling face on campaign buttons that declared, "I like Ike." He was America's favorite grandfather, the calm, steady hand that guided the nation through the anxious years of the early Cold War. The man who built the highways we still drive on today. The president who warned us about the military-industrial complex. But what if everything you think you know about this man is exactly what he wanted you to believe? What if the most powerful man of the 20th century deliberately made himself appear weak? What if the president who seemed disengaged and befuddled at press conferences was actually orchestrating events from the shadows with surgical precision? What if the general who crushed Nazi Germany spent his presidency secretly overthrowing democracies, manipulating world events, and pushing humanity to the brink of nuclear annihilation? Today, we are going to strip away the mythology and reveal the man beneath. We will journey into the classified archives that remained sealed for decades after his death. We will examine the private diaries and secret memoranda that reveal a mind far more cunning and calculating than history remembered. We will uncover the medical secrets that nearly ended his presidency, the personal betrayals that haunted his marriage, and the covert operations that destabilized nations and whose consequences we are still living with today. This is the untold story of America's hidden hand president, a man who perfected the art of invisible power, a man whose decisions still shape our world in ways most people never realize. This is what really happened to Dwight D. Eisenhower. To understand the man who would reshape the world, we must first travel back to a place that time has nearly forgotten. A dusty railroad town on the Kansas plains, where the 19th century was slowly giving way to the 20th, and where a remarkable family was about to produce not one, but multiple men of extraordinary achievement. Abilene, Kansas, in the 1890s, was a town caught between two eras. Just 2 decades earlier, it had been the wildest cowboy town in America, the endpoint of the legendary Chisholm Trail, where cattle drivers came to drink, gamble, and occasionally kill each other in the dusty streets. The famous lawman Wild Bill Hickok had once patrolled those same streets, bringing a semblance of order to the chaos. But by the time the Eisenhower family arrived, Abilene had transformed into something quieter. A respectable farming community of German immigrants, Mennonites, and hard-working families seeking a fresh start on the endless prairie. The Eisenhowers were among the poorest families in a town that was not wealthy to begin with. David Jacob Eisenhower, the patriarch, was a gentle and deeply religious man who had suffered a devastating business failure in Texas before retreating to Kansas with his wife Ida and their growing brood of boys. The failure had broken something in him. He would never quite recover his ambition or his confidence. He found work at a local creamery, laboring long hours for meager wages, while Ida stretched every penny to feed 7 hungry sons. The poverty was real and grinding. It shaped everything about life in the Eisenhower household. The boys wore clothes patched until they were more thread than fabric. Meat was a luxury reserved for special occasions. The family home, a small white house on the wrong side of the railroad tracks, became a symbol of their struggle. In Abilene's rigid social geography, the tracks divided the prosperous from the poor, and the Eisenhowers were firmly on the wrong side. This division was not merely economic, it was social, psychological, and in many ways permanent. The boys from the south side of the tracks were looked down upon by their more prosperous neighbors. They were seen as rough, as lower class, as destined for lives of manual labor. Young Dwight absorbed this reality every day. He understood that the world was divided into those who had and those who did not, and that he was firmly among the latter. But poverty, as it so often does, became a crucible. It forged in young Dwight a set of characteristics that would define his entire life. He learned that survival required cooperation. In a house with 7 boys and not enough food, you either worked together or you went hungry. Every brother had his chores. Every brother contributed to the family's survival. There was no room for selfishness, no tolerance for laziness. He learned the value of physical toughness. The boys from the south side of the tracks had to fight for respect, and Dwight became known for his fierce temper and his willingness to use his fists. There is a famous story often told of young Dwight engaging in a brutal 2-hour fist fight with a local bully. Neither boy would surrender. The fight ended only when both were too exhausted to continue. It was a draw, but it earned Dwight a reputation for tenacity that would follow him throughout his life. And perhaps most importantly, he learned to hide his true feelings behind an easy smile. This was not deception exactly. It was survival. In a world where showing weakness invited exploitation, the ability to appear cheerful and untroubled regardless of circumstances was a valuable skill. Young Dwight perfected this skill. His smile became his armor. This last lesson would prove to be the most valuable of all. Young Dwight was not obviously exceptional. He was not the smartest of the Eisenhower boys. That distinction belonged to Edgar, who would become a successful lawyer, or perhaps Milton, who would one day become a respected university president and advisor to multiple presidents. Dwight was somewhere in the middle, a boy of average grades and above-average athletic ability, with a passion for military history that seemed oddly out of place in his pacifist household. This passion was kindled by his mother, Ida, in one of the great ironies of American history. Ida Elizabeth Stover Eisenhower was a remarkable woman in her own right. Intelligent, well-read, and possessed of a fierce inner strength, she had overcome enormous obstacles to educate herself at a time when education for women was considered unnecessary and even dangerous. But she was also a devout pacifist, a woman who believed deeply that war was humanity's greatest sin. And yet it was Ida who encouraged young Dwight's fascination with military campaigns. Her extensive personal library included histories of the great commanders, and she would read to her sons by lamplight, bringing to life the battles of Hannibal crossing the Alps, Alexander conquering Persia, and Napoleon marching across Europe. She seemed to understand, perhaps, that knowledge itself is never dangerous. Only ignorance is. Dwight devoured these tales. He memorized the campaigns of the great generals. He sketched maps of their movements. He analyzed their strategies and debated their decisions with his brothers. In a boy growing up in poverty on the Kansas prairie, this fascination seemed almost absurd. What possible use could military history have for a poor boy from Abilene? The answer, of course, was everything. But Ida harbored a secret that the family would spend decades concealing. Sometime in the mid-1890s, she had undergone a profound spiritual transformation. She had abandoned the traditional Protestant faith of her upbringing and embraced a new, controversial religious movement. She became one of the early members of a group then known as the International Bible Students Association. This organization would later become known by another name, Jehovah's Witnesses. The implications of this secret cannot be overstated. The Bible students were viewed with deep suspicion by mainstream American society. They refused to salute the flag, considering it a form of idol worship. They rejected military service as a violation of God's commandment against killing. They predicted the imminent end of the world. They were seen as un-American, as subversive, as dangerous. For the future supreme commander of Allied forces in Europe, having a mother who was a prominent member of this pacifist, flag-refusing sect would have been politically devastating. It would have raised questions about his own loyalty, his own beliefs, his suitability for command. It could have ended his career before it began. The family home in Abilene actually served as a meeting place for the local Bible students group. The future architect of D-Day, the man who would lead millions of soldiers into battle against fascism, grew up in a house where pacifists gathered to study scripture and reject the legitimacy of earthly governments. The irony is almost too perfect to be believed, and yet the historical record is clear. This secret shaped Eisenhower in ways that historians are only beginning to understand. It taught him from his earliest years that public image and private reality could be two very different things. It showed him that a family could maintain a respectable facade while harboring unconventional beliefs beneath the surface. It demonstrated that survival sometimes required strategic silence. These were lessons he would never forget. These were lessons that would make him president. In 1911, Dwight Eisenhower escaped the poverty of Abilene through the only door available to him. He won an appointment to the United States Military Academy at West Point. It was not his first choice. He had originally hoped to attend the Naval Academy at Annapolis, drawn by romantic visions of the sea. But he was too old for Annapolis by a matter of months, and West Point would accept him. He arrived at the academy as an unknown quantity from an unknown place. Kansas might as well have been the moon to the wealthy Eastern cadets who dominated West Point's social hierarchy. Eisenhower was older than most of his classmates, poorer than almost all of them, and completely lacking in the social connections that smoothed the path for others. He had no family history of military service. He had no patrons to protect him. He had nothing but his wits and his will, and yet he thrived. Not academically. His grades were mediocre at best, placing him in the middle of his class. He later admitted with characteristic self-deprecation that he rarely cracked a book unless absolutely necessary. He was not interested in book learning for its own sake. He was interested in results. But he excelled at something far more important. He learned to read people. West Point in that era was a brutal environment. The hazing was relentless, designed to break down the ego and rebuild it in a military mold. The discipline was crushing, with demerits handed out for the slightest infractions. The pressure was immense, with cadets expected to perform at the highest level academically, physically, and socially. Eisenhower watched carefully as some cadets crumbled while others flourished. He noticed that the most successful cadets were not always the smartest or the strongest. They were the ones who understood the unwritten rules, the ones who knew when to push back and when to submit, the ones who could inspire loyalty without appearing to seek it. He became one of these men. His easy smile and self-deprecating humor made him popular. His willingness to bend rules without quite breaking them made him interesting. His athletic prowess, particularly on the football field, earned him respect. He was a promising linebacker and running back, known for his fierce competitiveness and his willingness to sacrifice his body for the team. He was being groomed for gridiron glory until a devastating knee injury ended his playing career and nearly shattered his spirit. The injury occurred during a game against Tufts when his knee was twisted catastrophically. He would never play football again. The injury was a turning point. Deprived of his outlet on the football field, Eisenhower fell into something like depression. He considered dropping out of West Point entirely. What was the point if he couldn't play football? But then something remarkable happened. He channeled his energy into something new. He became a coach, working with the junior varsity team, and in this role he discovered something remarkable about himself. He had a gift for taking talented individuals and forging them into effective units. He could see how different personalities could complement each other. He could identify the natural leaders and find ways to amplify their influence while managing the troublemakers. This was not a skill taught in any classroom. It was the skill that would one day win a world war. He graduated in 1915, part of a class that would become known as the class the stars fell on, for the extraordinary number of general officers it produced. Among his classmates were future luminaries like Omar Bradley and James Van Fleet. But no one predicted greatness for Dwight Eisenhower. His academic record was undistinguished. His career seemed destined for pleasant mediocrity. His first posting was to Fort Sam Houston in Texas, where he was assigned to train troops. It was routine work, far from the action that every young officer craved. This was exactly what a middle-of-the-pack West Point graduate could expect, but Texas would change his life in ways he never anticipated. Her name was Mamie Geneva Dowd. She was everything Eisenhower was not: wealthy where he was poor, sophisticated where he was provincial, socially connected where he was an outsider. The daughter of a successful Denver businessman, she had grown up in a world of servants and social seasons, of fine dresses and European vacations. She should have been completely beyond the reach of a junior officer with no money and no prospects. And yet, something sparked between them. Perhaps it was his confidence which seemed to transcend his circumstances. Perhaps it was his ambition which burned beneath his easygoing exterior like a banked fire. Perhaps it was simply chemistry, that mysterious force that draws people together against all logic. They married in 1916, just a year after meeting. Mamie was 19 years old. She had no idea what she was getting into. She had no conception of the sacrifices that military life would demand of her. She began what would become a 35-year odyssey through the transient, rootless world of military life. She would move more than 30 times, setting up households in cramped quarters on forgotten posts, hosting the endless social obligations required of an officer's wife, watching her husband disappear for months and years at a time. It was a sacrifice that would take a profound toll on her health and her happiness. But first, there would be joy. In 1917, their first son was born. They named him Dowd Dwight, but everyone called him Icky. By all accounts, he was a beautiful child, golden-haired and happy, with his father's smile and his mother's charm. He was the absolute center of his parents' universe. Eisenhower, the tough soldier who could bark orders at hardened troops, melted completely in the presence of his son. He would play with Icky for hours, teaching him games, reading him stories, carrying him on his shoulders. For a brief, shining moment, the future seemed full of promise. Eisenhower was a rising young officer. He had a beautiful wife. He had a perfect son. The world seemed bright. And then, just after Christmas in 1920, Icky developed a fever. Scarlet fever was a death sentence in an era before antibiotics. The disease attacked with merciless efficiency, ravaging the body's organs and overwhelming its defenses. The doctors could do nothing but watch. There was no treatment. There was no cure. Eisenhower and Mamie kept a helpless vigil at their son's bedside as the infection ravaged his small body. They watched him suffer. They watched him weaken. They watched the life drain out of him. On January 2nd, 1921, 3-year-old Icky died in his father's arms. Eisenhower would later call it the greatest tragedy of his life, a wound that never healed. "This was the greatest disappointment and disaster of my life," he wrote decades later, "the one I have never been able to forget completely." He would take long, solitary walks, weeping openly in a way that shocked those who knew him as a man of iron control. He would send flowers to Mamie every year on Icky's birthday, a ritual he maintained until his own death nearly 50 years later. The loss created a wall between husband and wife, a shared grief too painful to discuss. And it changed something fundamental in Eisenhower himself. The man who emerged from this tragedy was harder, more controlled, more capable of compartmentalizing his emotions. The easy smile remained, but it now concealed depths of pain that few would ever glimpse. Some historians believe this loss explains Eisenhower's famous emotional detachment in later life. He had learned, in the cruelest possible way, that loving something completely made you vulnerable to complete devastation. He would never be that vulnerable again. He would never again let anyone get that close. The 1920s should have been a time of advancement, but the peacetime army was a graveyard of ambition. The military had been dramatically downsized after World War I. Promotions were agonizingly slow. Eisenhower would spend an astonishing 16 years stuck at the rank of major, watching his career stagnate while the world passed him by. But he was not idle. He studied military theory obsessively. He wrote articles about tank warfare that anticipated developments decades in the future. He thought deeply about the nature of modern warfare, and he attached himself to a series of mentors who would shape his understanding of strategy, politics, and power. The most important of these was Fox Connor, a brilliant military intellectual who took Eisenhower under his wing during a posting to Panama. Connor was considered one of the finest minds in the American military, a man who understood not just tactics but grand strategy, not just battles but wars. Connor recognized something in the young officer that others had missed. Beneath the folksy exterior, beneath the easy smile and the self-deprecating humor, he saw a strategic mind of the First Order. He saw a man who could think multiple moves ahead, who could hold complexity in his head without becoming paralyzed by it. Connor gave Eisenhower an informal graduate education in the art of war. He made him read Clausewitz's On War 3 times. He made him study the campaigns of Napoleon and Grant and Sherman. He taught him about coalition warfare, the impossibly difficult task of coordinating armies from different nations with different cultures and different interests. And he predicted with eerie accuracy that another great war was coming and that Eisenhower would play a major role in it. The second crucial mentor was Douglas MacArthur, the most brilliant and most difficult personality in the American military. Eisenhower served as MacArthur's aide for nearly a decade, first in Washington and then in the Philippines, where he watched his boss attempt the impossible task of building a modern army from nothing. It was an education in managing ego. MacArthur was theatrical, vain, and supremely confident in his own genius. He demanded absolute loyalty from his subordinates. He could not tolerate disagreement. He was, in many ways, the opposite of everything Eisenhower would become as a leader. But Eisenhower learned to navigate the great man's moods. He learned to deliver unwelcome truths without triggering explosions. He learned to get things done without claiming credit. He learned, in short, to exercise power invisibly. He hated much of it. He chafed under MacArthur's domination. He resented being stuck in the backwater of the Philippines while history was being made elsewhere. He nearly resigned multiple times, but he stayed because he was learning skills that no classroom could teach. The most important skill was this: how to manage impossible people in impossible situations, how to achieve goals without appearing to pursue them, how to lead without seeming to lead. When war finally came, Dwight Eisenhower was ready. He just didn't know it yet. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor transformed America overnight. The sleeping giant had been awakened, and it needed commanders who could channel its fury effectively. In Washington, Army Chief of Staff George Marshall faced an impossible task. He needed to build an army from almost nothing. He needed to forge alliances with suspicious partners. He needed to plan invasions across 2 oceans. He needed to somehow defeat enemies on opposite sides of the globe simultaneously. And he needed subordinates he could trust absolutely. He remembered an obscure colonel who had impressed him with a war-planning exercise months earlier. The colonel had demonstrated an unusual ability to cut through complexity and identify core issues. He had shown a strategic mind that could see beyond immediate problems to long-term implications. Marshall summoned Dwight Eisenhower to Washington. What happened next defied all military precedent. In a matter of months, Eisenhower rocketed from obscurity to supreme command. He leapfrogged over dozens of more senior officers, men with more combat experience and more impressive records. He was given command of the largest military operation in human history. Why? The answer reveals everything about Eisenhower's genius and about Marshall's wisdom in recognizing it. Marshall chose him not because he was the best tactician. He wasn't. George Patton could outmaneuver him on any battlefield, not because he was the most experienced combat commander. He had never commanded troops in battle. His entire career had been spent in staff positions. Marshall chose Eisenhower because he possessed something far rarer. He could hold coalitions together. This sounds simple. It was anything but. The Allied forces in World War II were a seething mass of competing egos, national interests, and military doctrines. The British looked down on the Americans as amateur newcomers who had arrived late to the war and had much to learn. The Americans resented British arrogance and suspected their commitment to actually defeating Germany versus protecting their colonial empire. The Free French were impossible to work with, led by a man, Charles de Gaulle, whose ego rivaled the generals he commanded. The Soviets trusted no one and were trusted by no one. And within each national army there were generals whose egos were the size of continents. Bernard Montgomery was insufferable, condescending, and certain that he was the greatest military mind of his generation. He was also brilliant, and his troops adored him. George Patton was brilliant but uncontrollable, prone to outbursts that could derail entire operations. The British commanders and American commanders could barely stand to be in the same room with each other. Eisenhower managed all of them. His method was pure hidden hand. He made himself appear to be a simple, humble facilitator, just a country boy from Kansas trying to help everyone get along. He let others take credit for victories. He absorbed blame for failures. He played the role of the cheerful American who just wanted to win the war and go home. But beneath this facade, he was a master manipulator. He knew exactly when to stroke an ego and when to deliver a brutal ultimatum. He understood that sometimes you had to let a difficult subordinate think he had won an argument, even as you quietly arranged for the outcome you wanted all along. He kept detailed mental files on every significant officer, knowing their strengths, their weaknesses, and exactly which buttons to push. He could make Montgomery feel appreciated while ensuring that Montgomery's plans were quietly modified to fit the overall strategy. He could let Patton believe he was getting his way while actually channeling Patton's aggression in directions that served the larger war effort. He could navigate the impossible politics of coalition warfare, keeping the British and Americans working together despite their deep mutual suspicions. This was his genius, not tactics, not strategy in the narrow military sense, coalition management, ego wrangling, the art of invisible leadership. The invasion of North Africa in 1942 was his trial by fire. Operation Torch was a military success, but it plunged Eisenhower into a political nightmare that revealed the moral complexity of coalition warfare. To secure a rapid ceasefire with the Vichy French forces in North Africa, Eisenhower cut a deal with Admiral François Darlan, a Nazi collaborator whose hands were stained with the blood of Jews and resistance fighters. Darlan was despised by Free French forces and by liberal opinion throughout the Allied world. He was a symbol of collaboration, of the compromise with evil that Vichy France represented. The Darlan deal saved thousands of Allied lives. It ended resistance quickly. It allowed the invasion to proceed on schedule, but it provoked a firestorm of criticism. How could America, the arsenal of democracy, make bargains with fascists? Eisenhower learned a brutal lesson in the crucible of North Africa. War is not a morality play. Victory sometimes requires shaking hands with evil. The man who emerged from North Africa was harder, more pragmatic, more willing to make morally ambiguous decisions in pursuit of larger goals. This transformation would have profound implications for his presidency. The Italian campaign followed, a bloody slog up a mountainous peninsula that some historians consider a strategic error, a drain on resources that could have been used elsewhere. But it was all prelude to the main event, Operation Overlord, the invasion of France, D-Day. No military operation in history had ever been attempted on this scale. Eisenhower commanded nearly 3 million men, thousands of ships, an unprecedented air armada. The logistical challenges alone were staggering. Every bullet, every bandage, every gallon of fuel had to cross the English Channel. Every soldier had to be trained, equipped, transported, and landed on hostile beaches under enemy fire. But the real challenge was making the decision to go. The invasion was initially scheduled for June 5, 1944. On June 4th, a massive storm swept across the English Channel, making landings impossible. The seas were rough, the clouds were thick, paratroopers would be scattered, landing craft would be swamped, the invasion would fail. Eisenhower faced an agonizing choice: postpone the invasion and risk losing the element of surprise. The Germans would have more time to prepare. The Soviets would question Allied commitment. The invasion force could not be held in readiness indefinitely, or wait for the weather to clear and gamble everything on a brief window of acceptable conditions. His meteorologist, a young officer named James Stagg, predicted a 36-hour gap in the storm. It was marginal at best. Seas would still be rough. Clouds would hamper air support. Nothing was certain. Everything could go wrong. In a cramped room at his headquarters in Southwick House, surrounded by the most senior commanders of the Allied forces, Eisenhower made his decision. The weight of it was almost unbearable. If he was wrong, the invasion would fail. The war would be prolonged by years. Hundreds of thousands of additional lives would be lost. The Soviet Union might make a separate peace with Germany. Europe might be lost. The room fell silent. Every eye was on Eisenhower. "Okay," he said quietly. "We'll go." 2 words, the most consequential 2 words of the 20th century. That night, alone in his trailer, he wrote a press release to be used in case of failure. "Our landings in the Cherbourg-Havre area have failed to gain a satisfactory foothold, and I have withdrawn the troops. My decision to attack at this time and place was based upon the best information available. The troops, the air and the navy did all that bravery and devotion to duty could do. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone." He put the note in his wallet. He kept it there throughout the invasion. He was prepared to accept total responsibility for total failure. And then he went to watch the paratroopers board their planes. The invasion succeeded, but just barely. On Omaha Beach, the assault very nearly failed. Pinned down by withering German fire, the first waves were slaughtered. For hours, the outcome hung in the balance. Eisenhower came closer to using that press release than most people realize. The liberation of Europe that followed was no triumphal parade. It was 11 more months of bitter fighting, shocking casualties, and constant crises. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 was a near catastrophe that almost split the Allied forces. German forces surged through the Ardennes forest, creating a massive bulge in the Allied lines and threatening to reach the sea. Eisenhower's calm, steady leadership held the coalition together through it all. He made the decisions, he managed the egos, he kept the alliance functioning, and he did it all while projecting an image of unflappable confidence that concealed the anxiety that gnawed at him constantly. And then, in the spring of 1945, his forces discovered the concentration camps. Eisenhower insisted on seeing Ohrdruf, a subcamp of Buchenwald, with his own eyes. What he witnessed there changed him forever. The walking skeletons, the piles of corpses, the evidence of systematic industrialized murder on a scale that defied comprehension. He ordered every American unit in the area to tour the camps. He brought journalists and congressmen to bear witness. He understood with grim prescience that someday people would try to deny that the Holocaust had happened. He wanted the evidence to be overwhelming and undeniable. "We are told that the American soldier does not know what he is fighting for," he said. "Now at least he will know what he is fighting against." The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Dwight Eisenhower, the boy from the wrong side of the tracks in Abilene, had led the greatest military coalition in history to complete victory over Nazi Germany. He was the most famous and most beloved man in the world, but the hidden hand had more work to do. The Eisenhower who entered the White House in January 1953 seemed to be a different man from the decisive commander of World War II. He appeared older, more tired, content to let others handle the details while he spent his time on the golf course. His press conferences were exercises in obfuscation, with rambling answers that seemed to suggest a mind past its prime. Critics dismissed him as a figurehead, a ceremonial president who had delegated real power to his subordinates, a nice old man who was in over his head. The columnist Richard Rovere called his administration a government by crony. The liberal intelligentsia mocked him as a well-meaning amateur. This was exactly what Eisenhower wanted them to think. The truth, revealed only decades later when his private papers were finally opened to historians, was startling. Eisenhower was one of the most hands-on, detail-oriented presidents in American history. He ran his administration with the precision of a military campaign, personally involving himself in decisions large and small. But he did it invisibly. His method was to create the appearance of delegation while maintaining tight control. He would let his press secretary or his cabinet members make announcements and take heat for controversial decisions. He would pretend to be poorly informed about topics he had studied exhaustively. He would cultivate an image of benign detachment while his hidden hand-shaped events. The rambling press conferences were deliberate. Eisenhower confessed privately that whenever he wanted to avoid a direct answer, he would simply cloud his response in verbal confusion. Reporters would conclude that he didn't understand the question, when in fact he understood it perfectly and simply chose not to answer. The golf became part of the deception. Eisenhower genuinely loved the game, but he also used it strategically. While critics mocked his time on the links, they underestimated him. A president who played so much golf couldn't possibly be paying attention to serious matters. That was precisely the point. His approach to Joseph McCarthy demonstrates the hidden hand at work. McCarthy's anti-communist crusade was terrorizing Washington in the early 1950s, destroying careers with reckless accusations and threatening to tear the country apart. The senator from Wisconsin seemed untouchable. He had the support of conservative Republicans. He had the fear of the media. He had the momentum of the moment. Many urged Eisenhower to confront the senator directly, to use the power and prestige of the presidency to crush him. Eisenhower refused. "I will not get into the gutter with that guy," he said privately. Instead, he worked behind the scenes. He fed information to McCarthy's enemies in Congress. He encouraged the Senate investigation that would ultimately expose McCarthy's methods. He worked with journalists and television executives to ensure that McCarthy's increasingly erratic behavior would be broadcast to the nation. When McCarthy finally self-destructed during the Army-McCarthy hearings in 1954, Eisenhower's fingerprints were nowhere to be found. The hidden hand had struck without ever being seen. But the hidden hand had a darker side. In 1953, Eisenhower authorized a covert operation that would reshape the Middle East for generations. Operation Ajax was a CIA-backed coup against Mohammad Mossadegh, the democratically elected Prime Minister of Iran. Mossadegh's crime, in American eyes, was nationalizing Iran's oil industry, which had been controlled by the British through the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. The British were furious. Their most valuable overseas asset had been seized. They wanted Mossadegh gone. The British convinced Washington that Mossadegh was leading Iran toward communism. The evidence for this claim was thin to non-existent. Mossadegh was a nationalist, not a communist. He had no love for the Soviet Union, but the Cold War had made every independent nationalist leader suspect. If you weren't with America, you must be with Russia. The CIA, working with British intelligence, orchestrated a campaign of bribery, propaganda, and street violence. Paid mobs attacked Mossadegh's supporters. The military was bought off. In August 1953, Mossadegh was overthrown and the Shah of Iran was restored to power. Eisenhower celebrated the operation as a low-cost victory over communist expansion. It had cost less than $1 million and no American lives. It seemed like the perfect exercise of hidden hand power. The consequences would be catastrophic. The Shah's restored regime became increasingly authoritarian and corrupt. The secret police, Savak, tortured and murdered dissidents with American training and American approval. The Iranian people never forgot that America had destroyed their democracy. When revolution finally came in 1979, the fury was directed squarely at the United States. The hostage crisis, the rise of Islamic fundamentalism, the decades of enmity between America and Iran, all of it can be traced back to Eisenhower's decision in 1953. Guatemala followed the same pattern. In 1954, the CIA overthrew Jacobo Arbenz, another democratically elected leader whose land reform program threatened American business interests, specifically the United Fruit Company. Operation PBSUCESS installed a military dictatorship that would plunge the country into decades of civil war and genocide. The hidden hand was remarkably effective at achieving short-term goals, but it was catastrophically blind to long-term consequences. The 1950s are often remembered as a golden age of American prosperity, and in many ways they were. The economy boomed, the middle class expanded, suburbs sprouted across the landscape. Americans bought cars and televisions and washing machines in unprecedented numbers. It was the era of Leave It to Beaver and backyard barbecues, of confidence and optimism. Eisenhower presided over this prosperity, and he shaped it in ways that still affect us today. Eisenhower's domestic presidency was more successful than his foreign adventures, though not without its own complications and contradictions. The interstate highway system, authorized by the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956, was the largest public works project in American history. It would eventually crisscross the continent with over 40,000 miles of high-speed roads, transforming the nation in ways that are still felt today. The official justification was national defense. The highways would allow rapid military movement in case of invasion or domestic emergency. They would facilitate the evacuation of cities in case of nuclear attack. This was the Cold War logic that made the project politically possible. But Eisenhower had been dreaming of modern highways since 1919, when he participated in a military convoy that took 62 days to cross the country on primitive roads. The trucks broke down constantly. The roads were impassable in bad weather. The experience convinced him that America needed modern highways, and he never forgot it. The defense justification was at least partly a cover for a project he had wanted for decades. Hidden hand governance applied even to road construction. The highway system was a triumph of engineering and organization. But it also had devastating consequences that Eisenhower either did not foresee or did not care about. The highways gutted America's cities, slicing through urban neighborhoods and displacing hundreds of thousands of residents, disproportionately poor and black. They accelerated suburban sprawl and automobile dependence. They contributed to the decline of public transportation and the rise of an oil-based economy. Like so much of Eisenhower's legacy, the highways were both an achievement and a cautionary tale. The great unfinished business of his presidency was civil rights. The Supreme Court's Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954 declared school segregation unconstitutional. It was the most important civil rights ruling in American history, and it landed squarely in Eisenhower's lap. Privately, Eisenhower disagreed with the ruling. He believed social change could not be forced by courts, that it had to evolve naturally over time. He thought the court had overstepped its bounds. He worried about the backlash the decision would provoke in the South, but he was careful never to say these things publicly. He would not criticize the court, even as he refused to endorse its decision. His silence was interpreted by Southern segregationists as tacit support for their resistance. His reluctance to endorse the decision emboldened Southern resistance. If the president wouldn't support integration, why should anyone else? The forces of massive resistance organized and grew stronger, confident that they had time on their side. The crisis came to a head in Little Rock, Arkansas, in September 1957. 9 black students attempted to integrate Central High School. Arkansas Governor Orville Forbes, in a brazen act of defiance, mobilized the National Guard to prevent them from entering. For weeks, Eisenhower tried to resolve the crisis through negotiation. He met with Forbes. He sought compromise. He did everything he could to avoid using federal force in the South. But Forbes would not back down, and when a federal court ordered integration to proceed, a white mob surrounded the school, threatening violence against the students. Eisenhower was forced to act. On September 24, 1957, he did something no president had done since Reconstruction. He nationalized the Arkansas National Guard and sent the 101st Airborne Division to Little Rock to enforce integration. The sight was stunning. Paratroopers with fixed bayonets escorting 9 terrified but determined black students into the school. Federal troops in an American city enforcing the rights of American citizens against the violent resistance of their own government. Eisenhower had acted not out of passion for civil rights. He acted because Forbes had defied federal authority. The Constitution was being challenged. His duty as president was clear, regardless of his personal feelings about integration. It was a hidden-hand approach to morality. The right thing was done, but for institutional rather than humanitarian reasons. Whether this makes Eisenhower's action more or less admirable depends on your view of leadership and conscience. Throughout his presidency, Eisenhower projected an image of robust health. The grandfatherly smile, the vigorous golf games, the apparent energy all conveyed vitality and strength. It was a carefully maintained lie. In September 1955, Eisenhower suffered a massive heart attack. He was on vacation in Colorado when he felt severe chest pain in the middle of the night. His personal physician, Howard Snyder, initially diagnosed indigestion and gave him morphine for the pain. By the time the true nature of the crisis was recognized, hours had passed. The heart attack was serious enough that Eisenhower was incapacitated for weeks. He could not perform his duties. He could not make decisions. The government essentially operated on autopilot, with key decisions made by a small group of advisors operating without clear constitutional authority. The American public was given reassuring but incomplete information about the president's condition. The full severity of the attack was concealed. The administration projected confidence while privately panicking about what would happen if Eisenhower died or became permanently incapacitated. He recovered, defying the predictions of some doctors. But the heart attack forced serious discussions about presidential succession and the need for clear procedures when a president became incapacitated. These discussions would eventually lead to the 25th Amendment. Less than a year later, in June 1956, Eisenhower underwent major abdominal surgery for ileitis, a severe intestinal condition similar to what is now called Crohn's disease. The surgery was serious. The recovery was difficult. Once again, his life was in genuine danger. And once again, the full severity was hidden from the public. Then, in November 1957, Eisenhower suffered a stroke. This time the effects were visible and undeniable. His speech was slurred. He had difficulty finding words. His ability to think clearly was compromised. For a period of days, there were genuine questions about whether he could continue to serve. He recovered again, more slowly this time. But 3 major health crises in 3 years raised profound questions. How much was the American public entitled to know about their president's health? Was the government being run by a man who was physically capable of making sound decisions? Who was really in charge during the periods of incapacity? These questions were never fully answered during Eisenhower's lifetime. The hidden hand extended even to the president's own body. The image of strength was maintained, even as the reality of vulnerability was concealed. The 1950s were years of unprecedented anxiety. Americans lived under the shadow of the mushroom cloud. They built bomb shelters in their backyards. They taught their children to duck and cover under their desks. They watched the skies for signs of Soviet bombers that might bring nuclear annihilation. And at the center of this anxiety sat Dwight Eisenhower, projecting calm while secretly orchestrating one of the most audacious intelligence operations in history. While Eisenhower was managing his health crises and running his hidden hand presidency, another secret was unfolding high above the earth. On October 4, 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite. The beeping signal from space sent America into panic. The implications were terrifying. If the Soviets could put a satellite into orbit, they could put nuclear weapons anywhere on Earth. The missile gap had arrived, except it hadn't. Eisenhower knew something the American public did not. For years he had been authorizing top-secret reconnaissance flights over the Soviet Union using the U-2 spy plane. These aircraft, flying at altitudes above 70,000 feet, were believed to be beyond the reach of Soviet defenses. They photographed Soviet military installations with unprecedented detail. The U-2 photographs told Eisenhower what his critics could only guess at. There was no missile gap. The Soviet Union's strategic capabilities were far more limited than their propaganda suggested. The Soviets had perhaps a handful of intercontinental missiles. America had hundreds. The nuclear advantage was overwhelming. But Eisenhower couldn't reveal this information. The U-2 flights were themselves illegal violations of Soviet airspace. Admitting to them would create an international crisis. So he absorbed the criticism. He let the Democrats attack him for allowing a missile gap. He let himself be portrayed as weak and out of touch. Meanwhile, he quietly pursued policies based on intelligence he couldn't share. He refused to engage in a massive missile buildup that he knew was unnecessary. He held the line on defense spending despite enormous pressure. He knew the truth, even if he couldn't say it. It was hidden hand governance taken to an extreme. The president knew the truth but couldn't speak it. His critics were wrong but couldn't be corrected. The national interest required public deception. Then, on May 1st, 1960, the secret came crashing down. A U-2, piloted by Francis Gary Powers, was shot down over Soviet territory. The plane, supposedly invulnerable, had been hit by a Soviet surface-to-air missile. Powers survived and was captured. The Eisenhower administration, believing Powers was dead and the plane destroyed, issued a cover story. A weather research aircraft had strayed off course and was missing. There was no spy plane. There was no reconnaissance mission. It was all a misunderstanding. Nikita Khrushchev sprung his trap. He revealed that not only had the plane been recovered, but the pilot was alive and well and singing like a canary. The cover story was exposed as a lie. The American president had been caught in a blatant deception. Eisenhower was forced to admit the truth. He acknowledged that he had personally authorized spy flights over Soviet territory for years. It was a profound diplomatic embarrassment. A summit meeting with Khrushchev, scheduled for Paris, collapsed in acrimony. The chance for a breakthrough in Cold War relations evaporated. The U-2 incident reveals the ultimate limitation of hidden hand governance. Secrets can be kept for a time, but not forever. When they emerge, the damage is often worse for the concealment than it would have been for honesty. On January 17, 1961, 3 days before leaving office, Dwight D. Eisenhower delivered his farewell address to the nation. It would become one of the most famous presidential speeches in American history. He began by reflecting on the extraordinary changes America had undergone since his birth. A boy from the Kansas prairie had lived to see the atomic age, the jet age, the space age. Technology had transformed every aspect of human existence. But then he turned to a warning. "In the councils of government," he said, "we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist." The phrase military-industrial complex entered the American vocabulary that night. It has been quoted countless times by critics of defense spending, imperial overreach, and the influence of weapons manufacturers on American policy. The irony is almost too perfect to bear. Here was the most celebrated military hero of his generation, a 5-star general, the man who had commanded millions of soldiers and wielded unprecedented military power, warning the nation about the very establishment he had helped build. Was it hypocrisy? Or was it hard-won wisdom? Eisenhower had seen how the demands of the Cold War had transformed America. The permanent military establishment, the sprawling network of defense contractors, the intelligence agencies with their secret budgets and unaccountable power. These were all creatures of the era he had presided over. He had helped create them. He understood their necessity, but he also understood their danger. He had watched the pressure to spend more, to build more weapons, to prepare for more threats. He had seen how difficult it was to say no, how easy it was to let fear drive policy. He knew that the hidden hand he had wielded so skillfully could become something darker in less careful hands. The farewell address was his attempt to warn future generations. Whether they would listen was another matter. Dwight D. Eisenhower died on March 28, 1969, at Walter Reed Army Medical Center in Washington, D.C. He was 78 years old. His final years had been a slow decline, marked by additional heart attacks and the steady erosion of the vigor that had once seemed inexhaustible. His last words, spoken to his son John, were simple and direct. "I want to go. God take me." The nation mourned the passing of a hero. Flags flew at half-staff across the country. World leaders sent condolences. The funeral was a state occasion befitting a man who had led the liberation of Europe and guided America through some of its most anxious years. He was buried in Abilene, Kansas, in a small chapel on the grounds of the Eisenhower Presidential Library, just blocks from the modest house where he had grown up in poverty. The boy from the wrong side of the tracks had come home at last. For the next 2 decades, his historical reputation languished. The scholars who assessed his presidency were unimpressed. They saw a disengaged president, a man more interested in golf than governance, a caretaker who had wasted opportunities. Then the archives opened, and everything changed. The man historians found in the documents was not the passive grandfather of popular myth. He was a president who was deeply involved in every aspect of his administration. He was a leader who made his own decisions and held his subordinates to exacting standards. He was a strategic thinker of the First Order who deliberately created the appearance of simplicity while operating with extraordinary sophistication. The hidden hand had hidden even from history. But the same archives that revealed his competence also exposed his complicity in darker deeds, the coups, the overthrows, the secret operations that destabilized nations and killed thousands. The record is clear. Eisenhower knew. Eisenhower approved. Eisenhower was responsible. So who was the real Dwight D. Eisenhower? He was a boy from the poorest side of the tracks in a forgotten Kansas town. He was the son of a pacifist mother whose secret faith would have destroyed his career if it had been known. He was a father who lost his firstborn son and never fully recovered. He was a soldier who never saw combat until he commanded the largest military operation in human history. He was a general who understood the horror of war better than those who glorified it. He was a president who maintained peace at home while secretly waging war abroad. He was a man who perfected the art of appearing to be less than he was. The easy smile, the simple syntax, the golf games, all of it was a performance. Behind the mask was a mind of formidable complexity and a will of iron. His legacy is as contradictory as the man himself. The highways that bind America together, the CIA operations that tore other nations apart. The warning about the military-industrial complex, the expansion of the military-industrial complex. Perhaps the greatest lesson of Eisenhower's life is that leadership in a democracy is an impossible profession. You cannot tell the public everything. You cannot do only what is right. You must sometimes choose between bad options and worse ones. Eisenhower understood this better than most. He understood that the appearance of simplicity could be a tool of great power. He understood that the most effective hand is often the hidden hand. But he also understood in the end that hidden hands cannot stay hidden forever. The consequences of secret decisions eventually emerge. The costs of covert operations are eventually paid. The truth, however long delayed, eventually comes out. His farewell address was his acknowledgement of this reality. After a lifetime of hidden hand governance, he stepped into the light and delivered a warning. He was the calm at the center of the storm, a quiet, steady hand that shaped an era, a man far more complex, more cunning, and ultimately more consequential than he ever allowed the world to see. The mask he created was his greatest achievement and his most enduring mystery. More than 60 years after he left office, we are still trying to see the face behind it. And perhaps that is exactly what he would have wanted. The hidden hand, even in death, remained hidden. The full truth of the man emerged only slowly, reluctantly, as archives opened and memories faded, and the passions of his era gave way to the cooler assessments of history. We know more about Dwight Eisenhower now than his contemporaries ever did. And yet, in some fundamental way, he remains unknowable. He was a man of masks, the Kansas farm boy, the beloved Ike, the supreme commander, the grandfather president. Each mask served its purpose. Each mask concealed as much as it revealed. Perhaps that is the final lesson of his extraordinary life. In an age of transparency, of social media and constant exposure, we have lost something that Eisenhower understood instinctively. Some things work better in shadow. Some power is more effective when it cannot be seen. Some truths are too dangerous to speak aloud. Dwight David Eisenhower mastered these truths. He wielded them with skill and sometimes with ruthlessness. He shaped the world we live in for better and for worse. And then he smiled and waved and let us believe he was just a simple soldier from Kansas. That was his greatest trick of all.